Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this session today. Um, Thank you as well for the opportunity to present our research paper at the Third International Conference on Business, Economics, and Management. Today, I'll be sharing our study on the suspension of metal scrap imports and how the sudden policy change impacted Indonesia's metal industry. This issue is particularly relevant to this conference because it sits at the intersection of sustainability, regulation, and industrial resilience. The suspension of metal scrap imports became a major concern following the cesium 137 incident, which I'll explain in a moment. But before that, I would like to mention that our study was carried out by a multi-institutional team from Universitas Terbuka, University Sains Malaysia, and Universitas Islam Sumatera Utara. Each member contributed through literature analysis, interviews, and discussions with professionals from the industry. Now, let's start with what actually happened. Indonesia detected cesium 137 contamination in imported scrap metal. And as a response, the government immediately stopped issuing metal scrap import recommendations. And now, this became a serious problem, not just in policy, but in daily operations, because Indonesia's metal industry relies very heavily on imported scrap, and in some sectors, it's up to 95%. At the same time, companies were required to install two monitoring systems for emissions and radiation, namely Continuous Emission Monitoring Systems, or SEMS, and Radiation Portal Monitors, or what we call RPM. So, from the industry's perspective, this was not just a regulatory adjustment. It meant losing access to critical raw materials while simultaneously facing new and costly compliance obligations. So, in other words, the industry was hit from two sides at once. First, no raw materials, and second, new compliance pressures. So, we did our review on the literature, and several key themes stood out. The first finding is that sudden regulatory changes can significantly disrupt industrial operations. Second, resilient supply chains require anticipation, adaptability, and recovery capacity. And third, Indonesia's metal sector is structurally dependent on imported scrap as its primary raw material. And fourth, many companies, especially small and medium enterprises or what we call SMEs, are not fully prepared for costly technologies like SEMS and RPM. However, there is a gap in these findings, and that is no prior research has examined what happens when a contamination-driven import suspension and a mandatory technological requirement occur at the same time, nor how firms adapt to these combined pressures. This gap is crucial because it reflects a real dilemma faced by emerging economies. That is protecting environmental safety without undermining industrial continuity.
Recording in progress.
And that is exactly the space our study aims to fill. Okay. So based on this situation, our research team asked three main questions. First, how did the suspension of scrap imports affect production and supply chain continuity? Second, how did firms respond to the new SEMS and RPM compliance requirements? And the third, how resilient was the metal industry when facing these combined pressures? And to answer these questions, we applied a qualitative research approach, following established principles of qualitative inquiry as proposed by Creswell and Creswell. We used three main sources of data. First, a systematic literature review guided by Prisma, covering 12 relevant studies. And second, 8 semi-structured interviews with managers and workers from 4 metal manufacturing firms. And third, documents from Indonesia and Alpindo, as well as official regulatory notices related to the import suspension and the SAM's RPN mandate. And by integrating these sources, we aim to capture both policy level dynamics and real industry experiences. Okay, now we can move into the key findings of our study. The first and most immediate impact was raw material disruption. Because scrap imports stopped suddenly, companies reported production drops ranging from 20 to 60%. Then costs increased sharply because firms were forced to substitute scrap with more expensive materials such as billets and ingots. And some firms even struggled to meet delivery deadlines while facing real risks of losing long term customers. So, in short, production went down while costs went up. The second major issue was about supply chain instability. Due to regulatory uncertainty, foreign suppliers paused their shipments, and at the same time, demand in domestic market increased sharply, causing local scrap prices to surge. For companies using just-in-time systems, this situation was even more critical because they typically do not hold large stocks of scrap. Some firms even told us very honestly that if this continues for 2 more months, we may have to temporarily shut down. And while all of that was happening, companies also had to deal with new compliance requirements such as SAMS and RPM. These technologies require high investment, while the technical specifications were still unclear, and many SMEs were simply not ready, either in terms of infrastructure or technical skills. So this situation was not just a supply problem, it became a financial problem, a technical problem, and an operational problem all at once. So we can imagine how they must be feeling right now, the company. So when we put all these findings together, we realized that the industry wasn't facing just a single disruption. It was facing what we describe as a compound shock. This includes a regulatory shock, operational disruption, supply chain volatility, a compliance burden, and socioeconomic risks, particularly for SMEs. These layers interacted and amplified one another, making the impact far more severe than a single policy change. But nevertheless, despite these challenges, companies showed remarkable resilience. They managed to manage their remaining scrap more carefully. They reduce furnace utilization. They prioritize high margin orders. They postponed major investments and non essential spending. Some of them even renegotiated contracts with suppliers and buyers. And at the association level, Galunesia and Aplindo actively advocated for clearly guidelines and phased implementation with the policymakers. So this shows that even under intense pressure, firms continue to adapt. And this is one of the most important contributions of our study. So based on those findings, we can conclude that the metal industry experienced severe operational impacts due to raw material shortages. It also faced significant financial and technical burdens from compliance requirements. But nevertheless, firms demonstrated strong adaptive resilience. Therefore, we recommend several policy measures for the policymakers. One, phased implementations of SAMS and RPM. Two, restoring imports with stronger radiation screening. Three, clear and harmonized technical standards. Four, multi-layer radiation screening systems. Five, financial support for SMEs. Six, better coordination across ministries. And seven, long-term development of domestic scrap ecosystems. These steps can hopefully balance environmental safety with industrial sustainability. And that concludes our research. But there is a possibility of future research that may focus on maybe quantitative modeling of cost and production impacts, or longitudinal studies on compliance adoption and recovery, or Cross-country comparisons of radiation governance systems may be from Indonesia and other countries, and simulation-based evaluation of alternative policy pathways. Here are the key references that supported our analysis. And finally, we would like to thank our academic mentors, industry partners, and relevant ministries for their support. Let me close with a quote that truly reflects the spirit of this study. Resilience is not about avoiding storms, but learning to dance in the rain by Vivian Greeny. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.